The darkness of the upper plane wasn't empty. There, arranged in endless rows, luminous boards floated, each one formed by a sequence of panels connected by thin bridges of light. They were evolutionary paths, traveled through different milestones: fire, cultivation, metal, steam, energy, understanding, among many others. On these surfaces lay the races the gods had sown in distant worlds, silhouettes representing each active member of the corresponding species. Millions of figures moved in unison across their grids, pushing, dragging, climbing, working to make it through the challenges that blocked the way between adjoining achievements. Far from all those tables, where the deities debated or celebrated, there was one unclaimed board. Estes was beside it, standing on a small stool. His body gave off a faint light, enough that his silhouette seemed clothed even in nakedness. Blonde hair fell down his back like a thread of liquid light. The white ribbon tied on his forehead rested perfectly still, with no wind to stir it. White eyes with a luminous glow swept over the scene with the patience of a being who could neither die nor move forward. Only watch. And remember. A murmur slid through the plane, like a conversation too distant to make out clearly. The gods. A scattered chorus, detached, alien, and detestable. They were a constant presence in that twilight, each one watching over their own board, attentive to the performance of the species they had created, ready to intervene when extinction threatened. All but one. The one the herald had been assigned. On that grid, there weren't millions of silhouettes, not even a small crowd. There was only him, a bipedal figure, standing before the barrier that separated them from the next milestone. A faceless man. A solid black silhouette, raising his fist again and again in a motion repeated beyond what could be conceived. He struck. Without tools, wings, or natural armor. Not enough time. Or a god to shield him from extinction. And he struck, and kept doing it. Estes lowered his head, letting the glow of his eyes settle on him. He couldn't remember how many times he had watched that figure on the brink of conceptual disappearance, when humanity came so close to extinction that the silhouette nearly faded from the board. But it never did. It didn't retreat, or stop. The murmur of the divine chorus intensified like a collective sigh, unpleasant and heavy with condescension, yet never with the responsibility Estes had carried since Gear's fall. A diffuse, mocking voice echoed across the nearby plain. "The agreement was a favor, Herald. If it weren't for it, that race wouldn't exist anymore." Estes didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on the lone figure battering the hardened wall. In his mind, the voice of his own reflection rose, steady, aching, impossible to silence. "They call it a post-war pact, but it was an execution. Gear against everyone. My younger brothers were left alone." He drew a deep breath, though he didn't need to. They're on the board, a game none of them ever asked to take part in. The plane's murmur leaned into shared mockery. Estes tore his eyes away from the only man striking the wall and let his gaze sweep across the rest of the boards. The first row shone with arrogant intensity. On the board of the winged ones, thousands of slender silhouettes glided effortlessly from one panel to the next, a massive synchronized wing beat that let them overcome the obstacle between fire and cultivation, from cultivation to construction, from construction to mastery of the skies of their own world. They didn't need to bring anything down, they simply rose above barriers that for any other species would have been insurmountable. On the adjacent grid, the armored creatures advanced like a living battering ram, slamming into the intermediate trials, a force so overwhelming that the earliest levels barely posed any challenge at all. Farther on, the Herald watched amphibious races move effortlessly between watery and terrestrial squares, luminous beings crossing from one stage to the next, simply by intensifying their glow. Giant herbivores whose jaws swallowed the initial impediments. On every table, the crowds moved forward like tides. and when a conceptual plague manifested as a shadow over one of those species, something leaned down from high above the upper plane. The obstacle didn't vanish, but the species didn't fall. They didn't help them win, but they kept them from losing completely. Esther sensed one of those gestures. On the board of the winged ones, a symbolic illness spread like a grey stain among the silhouettes, consuming half the group. Before the damage became total, a halo bathed them. The plague was contained, leaving enough still standing for the species to keep its root. Another voice echoed in the distance, faintly dissatisfied. "Too close. If I lost them now, I'd have to start over." The boar's lights steadied. The winged ones kept moving forward. A similar cycle repeated on other tables. Famines blunted, collapses contained, catastrophes diverted. The herald tightened his fingers against his thigh, feeling the smooth texture, something physical to anchor him amid so much abstraction. His eyes returned, inevitably, to the solitary board he had been assigned, the one belonging to his younger brothers. At first glance, its structure was similar, a sequence of panels connected, each one marking a milestone. But there were two differences no deity bothered to hide. The first, between each panel there wasn't a simple trial, but a thick wall, hardened on purpose by the combined will of the other gods when the post-war pact was sealed. The second, the human board wasn't flat. While the other boards floated as horizontal surfaces, humanity's grid rose at a constant angle, tilted upward like an infinite mountain broken into steps. Each square was an apparent resting place, and, at the same time, a new stretch of slope to climb. Asus knew what it meant. His own were pushing uphill, always on the edge of sliding back. One misstep, and everything would come crashing down. He leaned forward a little, shifting his weight onto the balls of his feet to see better. On the first stretch, fire. The wall that separated total darkness from that first glimmer was thinner than the later ones, but still thicker than any obstacle seen on the other boards. The man had struck there until a spark, an orange thread of light, pierced the rock, and humanity below had learned to master flame. The next level, cultivation. Blows until a crack let through the first domesticated seed, blessing a fertile field that no longer depended on the world's whims. Blocks of ice rose behind the next wall, representing ice ages. Dark, dense stains spread across the surface in another section. Illnesses, pandemics, bodies falling. Too many times there came a series of red flashes, symbolizing wars. Domestication, metallurgy, cities, writing, machines, energy. Concepts piling up like scars along the ascending path. At each of those points, the wall grew stronger, and the man had been alone. No columns of bodies alongside him, no visible accumulated forces. Only his fist. A murmur cut across Asus's focus. "Your race almost went extinct again, herald." The voice came from the left. One of the faceless gods, a black mass, had turned its attention toward the board. "Don't you get tired of watching them die so quickly?" Asus didn't turn his head. His eyes stayed fixed on the silhouette that was crawling forward up the conceptual slope. The man stood before one of history's intermediate walls. Not the first, and not the last. Humans had just survived something that they, from the upper planes, simply called the Night of the Soul. The silhouette had thinned then, almost translucent, as if the entire species had been reduced to a microscopic thread, and instead of a steady fist, Asus had seen a tremor in the hand it used, barely perceptible. It struck anyway. "They're still going," Asus replied, letting out a sigh of relief. The god laughed, a hollow, resonant sound, out of sheer stupidity. The herald clenched his left hand hard, feeling the light of his skin flicker for an instant. "Or will," he said, without looking at him. He let the scene unfold before him. The human board overlaid itself with images that didn't belong to the upper plane, but to the echo of what was happening below. The man's face didn't exist, but Asus could almost imagine it. Not as a single individual, but as an endless sequence of superimposed faces. A hunter with skin torn by the cold, a woman bent over land that yielded no fruit, a child holding a tool too heavy, an old man who wouldn't see the dawn, but trusted that someday one of his own would. All of them contained within that one stubborn silhouette. The wall ahead thickened again in the conceptual vision, fed by the god's fear of what the humans might achieve if they advanced too quickly. Aestus raised his voice, in a tone barely above a whisper, though he knew no one but him was truly listening. In the face of the Black Plague, they didn't stop, he said, as the memory of the disease that had devastated them centuries ago unraveled across the surface of the board. In the face of the cold that nearly erased them, they didn't stop, he added, as the ice shattered like glass. When even their own minds begged them to give up, they still didn't stop. The man raised his fist. There were no wings on his back, no magical flashes surrounding his figure, no divine hand guiding him either. And he struck. The impact reverberated across the slanted surface. A crack, barely visible, appeared at the center of the wall. The light of the next panel let a pale thread slip through that opening. Estes felt something in his chest tighten, an ancient emotion rooted from before his younger brothers had even learned how to walk. The man stepped back half a pace, not to flee, but to build momentum. The silhouette seemed heavier, as if it carried not only its own body, but the weight of all who had fallen along the way. He struck again. The layered visions trembled. Famines compressed into that gesture. The silent sobs of those who died without seeing the next dawn embedded themselves in the sound of that blow. The voices that prayed for help and got no answer were trapped in the wall's vibration. He struck again. The cracks spread in an irregular pattern, and the next panel fled to life. The human climbed one more step upward. The herald knew that for humanity there was no literal wall. He thought about how they had no awareness of the plane above them, because none of the other races did either. What they called revolution, discovery, new paradigm, was nothing more than a clumsy translation of something his avatar had achieved in silence. Each near extinction, endless winter, night when everything seemed lost, hadn't stopped them. It had honed them. The other races, by contrast, showed a different pattern. Their board shone with the comfortable glow of a species that had enjoyed a fierce start, an explosive rise, full use of the gift their god had granted them. But upon reaching certain walls, their movement would cease. The massive silhouettes piled up before those limits, unable to bring them down. They had hit their ceiling. Humanity, though, seemed not to have. Aestus braced one knee on the stool, leaning in even farther. The ritual folds of the cloth cast a faint shadow across his luminous forehead, as if he wanted to hide the moisture that threatened to well up in his eyes. "Bravas," he murmured, though he didn't know whether his voice would cross the veil. "Keep going!" Before the darkness, and before the upper plane filled with grids of obstacles, there had been a different place. It was a space of warm whiteness, with no defined edges. In the middle of that radiance, Gia seemed to sink just slightly into a conceptual surface. In front of her chest, held in both hands, rested a sphere of light. It was small, and it pulsed with an irregular rhythm. It wasn't humanity yet, but it would be. Gia tilted her forehead toward the vessel, her face an impossible blend of emotions. Pride, tenderness, fear. "Easy," she whispered, as if she could calm a restless child. Soft footsteps sounded behind her, muffled by the whiteness. Aestus approached, smaller than he would be in the future. "Mother," he called, with a voice that still didn't know the weight of loss. "Are they ready?" Far off, at the edge of that reality, presences appeared, and the plane's light unraveled around them. Gia frowned. "They're coming for me, and for them." The herald took one more step, trying to see over his mother's fingers. "Are you going to give them a gift, like the others did for their races?" Delicately, she raised the sphere to the height of her many eyes. "If I give them wings, they'll be seen. If I grant them centuries," she went on, almost in a whisper, "the other gods will take them away. Then don't give them anything, the little one said, desperate. That way they won't be able to hate them. Gia drew a deep breath and said, My gift will be something they can't tear away. Aestus looked at her, confused. Listen, my children, she murmured, resting her forehead against the light. I won't be able to walk with you, or hold your blood-stained hands, nor be there when you think it's all over. But every time you feel like you can't go on, when the night tells you, stay on the ground. Her lips trembled. I will be that voice that whispers, get up, strike one more time. Aestus remained silent, contemplating the last panel of the human board. The conceptual slope, always rising, reached its highest point there. It was understanding. That clarity humanity had built blow by blow, unaware that every advance thundered in a space beyond their world. Before that space rose the wall of black quartz. It wasn't a simple boundary like the ones before. It seemed forged from the void. The gods had raised it with a very clear intent to prevent any species from going beyond its corresponding board. No race was meant to ever touch its perimeter. And yet... The man stepped up before the obsidian. The silhouette looked different. Aestus recognized that density. It was history made weight. Each strike that had split an earlier wall, each tragedy that had honed human purpose, and each step forward on that climb that had never offered rest. The god's contempt crackled when the wall vibrated for the first time. Did you feel that? Murmured one, his voice shaking more than he meant to hide. No, another replied. It's impossible. The herald didn't look away. The light spilling from the last panel lit the man's profile. He watched as it raised its fist once more. The blow fell. The wall answered with a dull pulse. It didn't crack yet, but the sound ran through the upper plane like a reminder of something the gods had preferred to forget. One deity lost composure. Damn, stubborn, inferior, it babbled, its voice breaking between fury and panic. They shouldn't be able to get that far. Aestus spoke without raising his voice. Do you think that ever stopped them? The man tensed his back, preparing a second blow. The echoes of humanity fell into place behind it, like a deep breath shared by billions of souls that seemed to be beginning to glimpse what they represented in that plane. Another blow. The black quartz trembled. A microscopic line appeared, barely enough to suggest that beneath it there was something more than darkness. The gods took a step back. Not back toward their boards, but back into themselves, as if they wanted to hide inside their own existence. It was the first time the upper plane, their claimed domains, had fed them fear instead of their usual sovereignty. Aestus felt the vibration under his feet. Bravas, he whispered, his voice barely breaking. The man raised his fist again. There was no doubt in his motion. Only will. That absurd, imperfect force that had held humanity up since his very first step. The fourth blow fell. The crack spread like a petrified bolt of lightning, climbing and dropping at the same time. A fragment of the wall broke outward from the board, dissolving the moment it touched the upper plane. The gods recoiled another step, almost in unison. The idea of being seen, understood, reached, was more intolerable than losing the race. Aestus dipped his head toward the man. For an instant, the veil that separated them seemed to tighten, thin, as if the next movement were about to pierce it. Strike, he said softly. I've wanted us to be together again for so long. The man lifted his fist one last time. All of humanity was behind that gesture. It struck. The upper plane trembled as if something older than them, something the gods themselves had buried beneath arrogance and fear, were waking on the other side of the wall. To listen.